The restaurant was quiet that evening. Soft music played in the background, and the golden lights gave the room a warm glow. At the corner table, a man sat with a serious face. His name was David. He was one of the richest men in the city, known as a powerful CEO who built companies from the ground up. People often whispered about him when he walked past, saying he was cold, strict, and distant. David had come here not for meetings or deals, but for something simple. He wanted a meal in peace. His life was filled with numbers, contracts, and boardrooms, but tonight he only wanted to sit down, eat, and think. He ordered a steak, his favorite, and leaned back in his chair. The waitress who came to his table was named Maria. She was young, with calm eyes that showed patience and kindness. She carried herself with grace, even though her uniform was a little worn from long hours of work. Maria had been working in this restaurant for months, but tonight her heart beat a little faster when she saw David. Not because he was famous, but because she knew something about him that few people did. She greeted him politely, placed a glass of water on the table, and wrote down his order. David barely looked at her, giving a short nod. To him, she was just another server in another restaurant. But to Maria, this moment meant more. She carried a small folded note in her apron pocket, and her fingers brushed against it as she walked back to the kitchen. The steak was prepared quickly, and Maria carried it carefully to his table. David looked at the food, ready to cut into it, but Maria gently placed the folded note beside his plate. Her hand trembled slightly, though she kept her face calm. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly. David raised an eyebrow. He was not used to being handed anything extra, especially not a secret note. For a moment, he thought it might be a request for money or a desperate letter. He had received many such things in his life, from people wanting his help or his signature. Still, something about Maria's quiet, steady expression made him pause. He picked up the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but quick, as if written in a hurry. His eyes scanned the words, and his heart gave an unexpected jolt. The note read, "You don't remember me, but I remember you. My life changed because of one decision you made years ago. Please don't leave before I can speak with you." David sat still, the fork in his hand frozen above the plate. His mind began to race. Who was this young woman? What did she mean by her life changing because of him? He had signed countless documents, made hundreds of business decisions, and closed deals that affected thousands of people. But here, sitting across from him, was someone who claimed to have been touched personally by his actions. Maria stepped back, giving him space, but she kept her eyes on him from the side of the room. She knew he had read the note, and she could see the surprise on his face. David's usual confidence seemed to waver. He was a man who never allowed emotions to guide him, yet something about the note pierced through the armor he had built around his life. He glanced around the restaurant, wondering if anyone else noticed, but all the other tables were busy with their own meals and conversations. He folded the note again, placing it near his glass. He did not call Maria back immediately, but the taste for the steak had left him. Instead, he leaned back and thought of the past. So many years of decisions, mergers, and contracts. Some of his choices had created jobs and growth. Others had caused layoffs and closures. He remembered faces, workers leaving factories, employees thanking him for new opportunities, and even angry voices shouting at protests outside his offices. Could Maria be connected to one of those moments? The music in the restaurant played on, but David barely heard it. His mind was on that single line, "My life changed because of one decision you made." He looked again toward Maria. She moved gracefully between tables, serving others, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She was waiting for him to respond. At last, he raised his hand slightly, and she walked back to his table. "Sit down," David said quietly, though his voice carried weight. I want to know what you mean. Maria hesitated. She had never expected to sit across from the richest man in the city, but she gathered her courage. She pulled a chair and sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. This is not easy for me, she began. But you deserve to know. David studied her closely, trying to place her face in his memory. Yet nothing came. He could not recall seeing her before, but her tone told him she spoke the truth. Maria took a slow breath, preparing to share a story that would change not only his evening but perhaps his entire outlook on life. And David, for the first time in years, felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Maria sat across from David, her eyes steady though her hands trembled slightly. She had waited for this moment for a long time. For weeks, she had wondered if she would ever have the courage to give him that note. Now that she sat in front of him, the weight of her own words pressed heavily on her chest. David, the powerful CEO, leaned forward. His steak sat untouched, the steam slowly fading into the air. He was not thinking about food anymore. His sharp mind, used to handling contracts worth millions, was now locked on one thing: this young waitress and the secret she carried. You said your life changed because of me, David said, his voice calm but serious. Explain what you mean. Maria nodded slowly. She did not want to rush. She wanted him to understand every word. Years ago, she began, your company closed one of its factories on the south side of the city. My father worked there. He was one of the many who lost their jobs when the factory shut down. David's eyes narrowed slightly. He remembered the decision. It had been a tough call, made after months of financial loss. The factory had been outdated, the costs too high. The board had pressured him, and finally, he had agreed to close it. To him, it was a number on a report, a business choice. To the families who depended on that factory, it had been something else entirely. Maria continued. After my father lost his job, things became very hard for us. We had little money. He searched for work everywhere but could not find anything stable. My mother tried to take small jobs, but it was not enough. We struggled to pay rent, and there were nights when we had very little to eat. David listened quietly. His expression did not change much, but inside, he felt a sharp sting. He had always known his decisions affected people, but hearing it directly from someone who had lived through the consequences was different. Maria's voice softened. My father was a proud man. He loved his work at that factory. When he lost it, he lost more than just a paycheck. He lost his confidence. He grew quiet, and his health began to suffer. I was still in school then, but I could see how heavy the burden was on him. David thought of the many faces he had seen outside his offices during protests. Angry, desperate people demanding answers. He had always walked past them with his head held high, telling himself it was just part of business. But now, hearing Maria's story, those faces seemed clearer, sharper, more real. Maria took a breath, her eyes lowering for a moment before meeting his again. But that is not the whole story. Something happened after that, something unexpected. And that is why I wrote the note. Because even though your decision hurt my family, it also led me to a path I never thought I would take. David tilted his head, curious. What do you mean? Maria folded her hands together, her voice steadying as she continued. When my father struggled, I realized I had to help. I was young, but I knew I could not just sit and watch. I started working part-time, first in small shops, then in cafes, and finally here at this restaurant. At first, it was just to support my family, to keep food on the table. But along the way, I discovered something inside myself. I learned how strong I could be. I learned how to manage, how to stay patient, and how to keep moving even when life was heavy. Her eyes shined faintly, not with tears but with quiet strength. So yes, Your decision closed a door for my father. But for me, it opened another one. Without that struggle, I might never have learned how to stand on my own feet. That is why I had to speak to you. I wanted you to know that your choices are not just numbers. They shape real lives. David leaned back, his mind filled with thoughts. He had faced countless business reports, attended endless board meetings, and listened to advisors who spoke only in profits and losses. Rarely had anyone spoken to him like this honestly, personally, with no fear of who he was. For the first time in years, David felt the walls around his heart weaken. He had built those walls to keep emotions out, to protect himself from guilt or doubt. But Maria's words slipped through, simple and direct. I see, David said finally, his voice lower than before. You wanted me to know the human side of my decisions. Maria nodded. Yes. I am not here to blame you. I am here because I believe people like you need to hear these stories. Maybe it will help you when you make the next big choice. Maybe you will remember the families behind the numbers. The restaurant around them buzzed with quiet conversations and clinking dishes, but at that table, the air felt heavy with meaning. David studied Maria again. She was not asking for money, not begging for help. She had given him something far more powerful, a glimpse of truth. David tapped the folded note on the table. You have courage, he said. Most people would never dare to speak to me like this. Maria gave a small smile. Sometimes courage is the only thing we have left. David looked at his steak again, untouched, now cold. For the first time in a long while, he felt no hunger for food. Instead, he felt hunger for something else: understanding, clarity, perhaps even redemption. Maria stood slowly. Thank you for listening. That is all I wanted. But David's voice stopped her. No. This is not the end. I want to know more. Sit back down. I am not finished hearing your story. Maria hesitated, then lowered herself back into the chair. The conversation that followed would take them both further than either expected. And so, the night that began with a simple steak order was turning into something neither of them could forget. Maria sat back in her chair, unsure if she should continue. She had already shared more than she planned. But David's eyes told her he was not finished listening. There was a new softness in his expression, something she had not seen when she first approached his table. You want to know more? Maria asked carefully. Yes, David replied. If I have affected your life this much, I should hear the full story. Not half of it? Maria looked down at her hands for a moment. She felt the weight of her memories pressing against her, memories both painful and important. Then she lifted her head. Very well. I will tell you everything. The restaurant lights glowed warmly around them, but at that table it felt like a different world, a private space where two lives were crossing in unexpected ways. My father, Maria began, was a man of pride, as I told you. When the factory closed, he tried to stay strong for us, but I could see how it broke him inside. He loved working with his hands, building things, solving problems. Losing that work took away a part of his identity. David nodded slightly, his mind pulling back images of board meetings where charts and numbers were discussed without a single mention of names or faces. Maria continued, her voice soft but steady. I remember one evening when he sat quietly at the table, staring at his empty hands. He said to me, Maria, life will test you. When it does, you must choose if you will bend or if you will break. At the time, I did not fully understand. But as days turned into months, I realized he was teaching me how to survive. Her eyes grew distant as she spoke, as though she was reliving those nights. I started working to support my family. It was not easy. I cleaned tables, washed dishes, carried heavy trays. Many times I was tired, but I knew I had no choice. My younger brother needed school supplies. My parents needed help with bills. If I stopped, everything would fall apart. David leaned forward, listening closely. He had spent his life commanding attention in boardrooms, but never had he listened with this kind of focus. Maria gave a small smile, though it carried sadness. At first, I was angry. Angry at the world, angry at the decisions made far away by people who never saw our faces. But over time, that anger changed. It became fuel. I told myself I would not let hardship define me. I would use it to grow stronger. She paused, taking a quiet breath. That is why I am still here. I could have given up, but I chose not to. I chose to work harder, to learn, to keep going. And in that way, your decision, though it hurt, also shaped me into who I am today. David sat silently, his chest heavy with thought. He remembered signing the order to close the factory. He had done it to save the company's larger future, but he had never stopped to consider the ripple it sent across families like Maria's. "Do you hate me for it?" David asked suddenly, his voice quieter than before. Maria shook her head gently. "No. Hate only weakens the heart. I was angry once, yes, but not anymore. If I had stayed angry, I would not be able to stand here today. I would not have found my strength. What I want is not revenge or blame. I want you to see the faces behind the choices you make. That is why I gave you the note." Her words hung in the air like a quiet bell, simple yet powerful. David looked at her closely, searching for any trace of bitterness, but all he saw was truth. For the first time in many years, he felt a small crack in the armor of his carefully built life. He had always told himself that his choices were logical, necessary, just business. But now he could no longer deny the human stories behind those numbers. "You remind me of something I forgot long ago," David said slowly. "When I first started my company, I promised myself I would build not only profit but also people's trust. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I let numbers blind me." Maria listened, surprised to hear such honesty from a man like him. She could see that her words had touched him deeper than she expected. The music in the restaurant shifted to a soft piano melody, filling the silence between them. Finally, Maria spoke again. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded." Maria's last words stayed in the air like a soft echo. She had said she wanted to remind him, not accuse him. For a man like David, who was used to hard talks, sharp deals, and endless reports, this moment felt different. It felt personal. He leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the folded note beside the cold steak. His sharp eyes, usually hard and distant, now carried a weight of thought. For once, David did not have a quick answer or a strong defense. Instead, he was quiet. Maria sat across from him, unsure of what would happen next. She had feared he might dismiss her words, or worse, grow angry. But what she saw in him now was not anger. It was something else, something she had hoped to awaken. Finally, David spoke, his voice lower than before. "You remind me of something I buried a long time ago. When I first started, I wanted to build a company that helped people. I believed success was not just about profit but about giving others a chance. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that." Maria nodded softly. "Sometimes life makes us forget. But we can remember again." Those words touched David more than he wanted to admit. He glanced around the restaurant. People were laughing, eating, enjoying their evening. Yet at his table, the air felt heavy, almost sacred, as though time itself had slowed down to let this conversation happen. He looked back at Maria. "Tell me," he said, "what did you hope to gain by telling me this? You risked much by slipping me that note. Most people would never dare." Maria lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "I did not want money. I did not want pity. I only wanted to be heard. I wanted you to see that behind every decision, there are people like my family. I wanted you to know that you hold great power, and with it, great responsibility. Her words, simple and calm, carried more strength than a boardroom full of advisors. David felt them settle inside him like stones in water, sinking deep. For a moment, silence stretched between them. David's mind went back years, to a time when he himself had been a young man, full of dreams, standing at the edge of his first big business decision. He had been idealistic once, believing that wealth could be used to lift others. But the world of business had been harsh, and slowly, little by little, he had built walls to survive. Now, facing Maria, those walls began to crumble. "Do you believe people like me can change?" David asked suddenly. Maria looked at him with steady eyes. "Yes. I believe everyone can change. The question is if they want to." Her answer was so direct, so simple, that David felt a quiet sting. He had built his empire on being in control, on having answers, but here sat a young waitress who spoke to him with more wisdom than many of his closest advisors. He gave a small sigh, almost like a man carrying a heavy load. "You are brave. To speak like this, knowing who I am. You could have stayed silent." Maria shook her head. "Silence helps no one. My father taught me that. He said when we stay silent in front of power, we give it permission to forget us. I could not let that happen." David tapped his fingers lightly on the table. His mind was racing, but not with numbers or deals this time, with memories, regrets, and possibilities. For the first time in years, he saw himself not just as a leader of companies but as a man whose choices shaped lives. The steak grew colder, the glass of water untouched, but neither of them cared. Their conversation had moved beyond food and into the heart of truth. After a long pause, David said, "Maria, you have reminded me of something I needed to hear. I do not know what I can do to change the past, but perhaps I can change the future. If I wanted to make things right, how should I begin?" Maria blinked in surprise. She had not expected him to ask such a question. For a moment, she was silent, thinking carefully. Then she answered, "Start by listening. Listen to the people who are affected by your choices. Not just the board, not just the numbers, but the workers, the families, the ones whose voices never reach your office." David nodded slowly, her words planting themselves in his mind. He had always relied on charts, graphs, and reports. Rarely had he asked for the human side of the story. Maria added, "If you remember the people, the numbers will follow in a better way. People who feel seen and valued work harder, stay loyal, and build stronger futures." David gave a small smile, the first true one of the night. "You speak as though you should be running a company yourself." Maria laughed softly, though there was no arrogance in her tone. "I only speak from what I lived. Hardship can teach lessons no school ever will." The conversation between them grew lighter for a moment, though the meaning stayed strong. David realized he had not spoken this openly with anyone in years. The restaurant was beginning to quiet down as the evening passed, but David felt no urge to leave. He felt as though something inside him had shifted, like a compass pointing to a new direction. He looked at Maria again, her calm presence steady as a flame. He knew this meeting was no accident. It was a reminder, a lesson, perhaps even a chance for redemption. And in that moment, David made a silent promise to himself he would not let her words be forgotten. He would carry them forward, into his decisions, into his company, and perhaps into a different kind of future. The restaurant was nearly empty now. Only a few tables were still filled, and the soft music played in the background like a gentle whisper. Yet at David's corner table, the air still carried the weight of their conversation. Maria shifted slightly in her chair. She wondered if she had said too much, if maybe she had crossed a line by speaking so boldly to a man like David. But when she looked at him, she saw no anger. Instead, she saw something far more surprising: reflection. David was not the same man who had walked into the restaurant earlier that evening. His shoulders were less rigid, his eyes less distant. He looked like a man who had been shaken awake from a long sleep. He leaned forward slightly. "Maria," he said, "you have given me something rare. Most people around me only speak what they think I want to hear. They flatter me, agree with me, and avoid telling me the hard truths. But you did the opposite. And I respect that." Maria gave a small nod. Sometimes truth is the only gift we can give. David studied her carefully. She was young, dressed in a simple uniform, carrying the air of someone who had faced struggle but refused to bend under it. In her, he saw the strength he once admired in others before the world of business hardened him. "Tell me," David said, "what do you dream of? Surely working in this restaurant cannot be your final goal." Maria hesitated. She had never shared her private hopes with a customer before. But something about David's tone felt sincere. After a moment, she answered, "I want to finish my studies. I had to stop when my family's money ran out. But I dream of going back one day. I want to learn business, not to build wealth for myself, but to help others like my family. I want to show that companies can succeed without forgetting the people." Her voice carried quiet passion, and David felt a spark inside him. "You want to change the way things are run," he said, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "Yes," Maria replied firmly. "I believe it is possible." David leaned back, letting her words sink in. For years, he had sat in meetings filled with men and women who spoke only of profit margins, market shares, and competition. Yet here was a young waitress, speaking of vision, hope, and balance. It struck him as something more powerful than all the boardroom speeches he had ever heard. "Maria," he said slowly, "you may not realize it, but you already think like a leader." Maria shook her head with a small smile. "Leaders are people like you. I am only a worker trying to get by." David's eyes grew sharp, though not unkind. "Do not make the mistake of thinking leadership comes from position. True leadership comes from vision and courage. And you have both." Maria's heart gave a small leap at his words, but she stayed composed. She was not sure if he was simply being kind or if he truly believed what he said. The clock on the wall ticked softly as silence passed between them. Then David spoke again, his tone more serious. "Maria, tonight you reminded me of what I lost, and of what I must regain. I cannot change the past, but I can change the road ahead. And I will." His words carried weight, not as empty promises but as a vow from a man who rarely allowed himself to speak without intent. Maria studied him. She could see the shift in his eyes. It was as if a new fire had been lit inside him, one that had been long buried. "What will you do?" she asked carefully. David's lips pressed into a thin line before he answered. "I will return to my company with new eyes. I will look beyond numbers and see the people. I will find ways to balance profit with responsibility. And I will ensure no decision is made without remembering families like yours." Maria listened in silence. His words sounded sincere, but only time would reveal their truth. Still, a part of her wanted to believe him. "You speak of change," Maria said softly. "But change is not easy." David gave a small smile, one touched with humility. "I have built empires. I have faced storms in business and in life. Change will not be easy, but it is possible. And now, for the first time in years, I want it." The restaurant manager walked by, giving Maria a gentle reminder that her shift was ending. She rose from her seat, smoothing her apron. David stood as well. For a moment, they faced each other not as CEO and waitress, but as two people who had shared truths few others ever would. "Maria," David said, his tone firm yet kind, "tonight you gave me something no wealth can buy. You gave me a chance to see again. I will not forget it. Maria smiled faintly. Then my note was worth giving. As she turned to leave, David called after her. This will not be the last time we speak. I promise you that. Maria paused, glancing back. She did not answer, but the quiet hope in her eyes was enough. When she disappeared into the back of the restaurant, David sat again at his table. His steak was cold, his glass untouched, but he felt more full than he had in years. For the first time in a long while, he left the restaurant not with the weight of his empire on his shoulders, but with the spark of something greater, a promise to himself and to the people who trusted his decisions. And deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, David woke earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through his wide windows, spreading across the polished floor of his penthouse. Yet he did not feel the usual calm of success. Instead, his thoughts returned again and again to Maria's words from the night before. He had not eaten the steak, but the conversation had filled him with something more lasting than any meal. Maria's courage, her honesty, her reminder of humanity behind numbers, it all clung to him like a shadow. David dressed quickly and headed to his company headquarters. The tall glass building stood proudly in the heart of the city, a symbol of wealth and power. For years, he had walked into it with a firm step, confident and unshaken. Today, however, he walked in with a different mind. As he entered the boardroom, his executives were already waiting. They stood as he came in, their faces expectant. These were people who lived by numbers, who measured success only in profit. David had once been the same, but now something in him had shifted. He sat at the head of the long table, his sharp eyes moving across the room. Today, he said, we will not talk only about profit margins. We will talk about people. The board members exchanged quick glances. Some looked confused, others nervous. This was not the usual language of their CEO. David continued, his tone steady. Last night, I was reminded that every choice we make touches lives far beyond this room. When we close a factory, it is not just a building shutting down. It is families losing income. It is children going without school supplies. It is people losing hope. We cannot ignore this anymore. One of the senior directors spoke carefully. Sir, with respect, we cannot run a company on emotions. We must stay focused on results. David's eyes sharpened. Results mean nothing if they destroy the very people we claim to serve. A company that forgets its people will one day collapse. I built this empire to last, and for that, we must do better. The room fell silent. For the first time, many of them saw a side of David they had never seen before. He was not speaking as a cold businessman but as a leader carrying new fire in his voice. We will review every decision, David ordered. We will look at the human side as well as the financial side. I want reports not only of profits but also of how our choices affect the communities around us. From this day, we will run this company differently. The executives nodded slowly, some reluctantly, others with quiet respect. After the meeting ended, David returned to his office. The tall glass windows gave him a wide view of the city, the same city where Maria lived, worked, and struggled. For years, he had seen this city as numbers and markets. Now he saw it as lives and stories. He thought again of Maria's dream of finishing her studies. A young woman with so little had shown him more truth than the richest advisors he had ever hired. Her voice echoed in his mind. Start by listening. At that very moment, David made a private decision. He would not let Maria's story fade into memory. He would take action. That evening, David returned to the same restaurant. The staff looked surprised to see him again so soon, but he asked quietly if Maria was working. She appeared after a moment, her eyes wide with surprise. You came back, she said softly. Yes, David replied, his tone calm but firm. I said our conversation was not the end, and I meant it. They sat again at the same table. This time, David did not order a steak. Instead, he asked only for water. He was not here for food, he was here for purpose. "Maria," he began, "last night you gave me a gift. You reminded me of something I lost. Today, I spoke to my board and told them we must change. It will not be easy, but it has begun." Maria listened carefully, her face thoughtful. She wanted to believe him, yet she knew promises were easy to make. David continued. "But that is not all. I also want to help you. You spoke of your dream to finish your studies. I want to support you in that." Maria's eyes widened. "Why me? There are so many others who struggle." David nodded. "Yes, but you had the courage to speak. You did what many others would not. You reminded me of my duty. In return, I want to give you a chance to follow your dream. It is not charity, it is an investment in someone who has already proven she has vision and strength." Maria's heart pounded. She had never expected such words from him. Part of her wanted to accept, but another part hesitated. "I do not want pity," she said softly. David shook his head. "This is not pity. This is belief. I believe you can do something great, Maria. And I want to help you do it." The restaurant around them buzzed with quiet sounds, but for Maria, the world seemed to stop. She looked into his eyes and saw no pride, no coldness, only sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. "If you truly mean this, then I will not waste the chance." David gave a small smile. "I know you won't." At that moment, a silent agreement passed between them. One had the power to change the future, the other carried the courage to guide that power in the right direction. As Maria returned to her work, David stayed a little longer, feeling lighter than he had in years. He knew the road ahead would not be simple, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it with her reminder burning like a steady flame inside him. Weeks passed since that night in the restaurant, yet the memory of Maria's words stayed alive in David's mind. He carried her note with him, folded neatly in his wallet, as a reminder of the promise he had made. The company began to change, little by little. At first, the board had doubts, but David's determination left no room for argument. He launched new programs to listen directly to workers, sending teams to visit factories, stores, and offices. He ordered reports not only about sales and growth but also about employee well-being. Some executives resisted, but David reminded them of a simple truth: a company that takes care of its people will last longer than a company that only counts profits. Slowly, the culture began to shift. Workers who once felt unseen now had a voice. Managers who once cared only for numbers now had to consider families, communities, and lives. It was not a quick process, but it was real. Meanwhile, Maria's life also began to change. One morning, she received a letter delivered to the restaurant. It was from a scholarship fund set up quietly in her name. The letter explained that her education would be fully supported, giving her the chance to return to her studies. When Maria read the words, her hands trembled. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but she never imagined it would come through the same man whose decision once hurt her family. She showed the letter to her parents, who were moved beyond words. Her father, though older and still carrying the scars of his job loss, smiled with pride. "You see, Maria," he said softly, "your courage brought this. You spoke when others would have stayed silent. Now doors are opening." Maria returned to school with determination. She studied hard, often staying up late with her books. Every lecture, every page reminded her why she was there, not just for herself, but for all the families like hers. She wanted to learn so she could one day help shape businesses in a way that remembered people. David kept in touch with her, not as a boss or benefactor, but as a mentor. He would meet her sometimes at the same restaurant, though now they shared more than food, they shared ideas. David would ask her what she was learning, and Maria would share her thoughts with honesty. Their conversations inspired him to keep pushing for change inside his company. Months turned into a year. The company began to gain a new reputation in the city. It was no longer seen only as a giant corporation but as a place that valued its workers. Employees who once feared layoffs now felt hope. Families who once struggled now found stability. It was not perfect, but it was a start. David noticed something else as well. He himself had changed. He no longer walked with the same cold distance he once carried. People noticed he listened more, spoke with more patience, and made decisions with both mind and heart. One evening, as the city lights glowed outside his office, David looked out over the skyline. The tall buildings, the busy streets, the endless movement, all of it felt different now. He no longer saw only markets and profits. He saw stories. He saw Maria's family, the factory workers, the children who depended on their parents' jobs. And he saw his own responsibility in it all. That weekend, David returned once more to the restaurant. Maria was there, serving tables with her usual calm. When she saw him, she smiled warmly. "You kept your word," she said quietly when she came to his table. "And so did you," David replied. "You studied, you worked hard, and you reminded me of who I should be. That is something I will never forget." They spoke for a long time that night. Maria shared her vision of starting a small foundation in the future, one that would help students from struggling families gain access to education. David listened, nodding with interest. "When that day comes," he told her, "I will be there to support you. Because leaders like you are the future." Maria laughed softly, shaking her head. "I am not a leader yet. I am still learning." David's eyes held steady. Leaders are always learning. That is what makes them true leaders. As the night came to a close, David left the restaurant with a lighter step. Maria returned to her work, her heart full of hope. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring, but they both knew this change had begun, and it would not stop here. For David, a steak dinner had turned into the night that reshaped his life. For Maria, a simple note had opened doors to a future she once thought impossible. Two lives had crossed in the most unexpected of ways, and from that crossing came something far greater than either of them had imagined. And as the city moved on with its endless pace, a quiet truth remained: one decision, one voice, and one act of courage can set in motion a change that touches many lives.